move weapons into these countries, then there'll be a war. Now, obviously, Russia's already been at war against Ukraine for almost 8 years. The Kremlin's been lying about it every single day, but just mean it to escalate the conflict. It's been fairly limited to Luhansk, Donbass. Obviously, they seized Crimea, attempts to seize Odessa and Berdyansk unsuccessfully. But so. And why on earth have they put 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border and kept them there for a few weeks, which costs quite a lot of money? They can't stay there indefinitely. They've either got to move forward or they've got to go back to barracks. So after the Russian New Year's holidays were over, these negotiations took place. Why is Putin doing this? Well, partly because he's trying to intimidate NATO into giving these promises, at least get some sort of guarantee out of it, to scare the Ukrainians off recovering their own sovereign territory. And he's also aiming at a domestic audience. Because they're suffering terribly from Omicron. Remember, they're very vaccine shy. They don't trust their government, quite rightly. They don't trust the vaccine. There were serious discrepancies in the data. I mean, their vaccine's obviously somewhat effective. And so that means that the coronavirus there is even more of a problem than it is elsewhere. And obviously the Russian government lies about everything and about coronavirus deaths as well. When you see something like 800 excess deaths last year, which were not counted as coronavirus deaths. Russia's put forward these draft treaties. There's been a flat no from NATO. Of course, we're not going to vow not to take more countries in. We are, Ukraine is an absolutely sovereign nation, have the right to join any military alliance they want, and why wouldn't they want to join NATO? So there are various meetings between the United States and Russia, between the NATO Council and Russia, between the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But, Ukraine didn't get to be there. So you notice how Russia doesn't consider Ukraine to be Ukraine's business. They're going over their heads to speak to somebody else. As in spheres of influence, you stay out of it, and then we'll be able to grab territory. So Putin has matured one day since the Soviet Union, believing that he has the right to interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries, when obviously fiercely guarding his own independence, and has often doubted the right of Ukraine to be independent, which is just outrageous. They've got diplomatic relations with Russia, so they are recognized. They are a lawful country. It's a bit like saying that Russia's not a real country. It was part of the Mongolian Empire for a while. Some of us are part of Poland for a while, or things like that. Does Britain get to take back India? I mean, come on, this is preposterous. Russian influence in Ukraine is seen at diminution, partly because of Putin's hyper-aggressive policies, and there are Russian speakers in Ukraine, maybe about 40% of the population, which is not quite the same as ethnic Russians. Some people are ethnic Ukrainian, but speak Russian as their first language, or in some cases their only language, but that's declining. Some of those people are dying off, and Ukrainians, the rising generation, is more Ukrainian speaking. So Viktor Medvedchuk is a leading Ukrainian politician, and he's got Putin as the godfather to his daughter, and he's under house arrest for something or other. So people who are pro-Moscow, there are not so many of them in Ukraine. Obviously, those who are, mostly in Crimea, Luhansk, and Donbass, which are controlled by Russia anyway, officially in Crimea's case, unofficially in the case of the other two regions. And the Russians having to subsidize them. Now, Ukraine could cut off water to Crimea, but do you want 3 million people dying of thirst, and it's your fault? I know you can drink from streams or whatever, or you could force Russia to try and provide an awful lot of water. It would be a big headache for them. Russia could hit back, cutting off oil, gas, and electricity to Ukraine. So the situation is obviously getting worse for Russia all the time as Ukraine becomes more nationalistic, more pro-Western. So this is perhaps his last chance to retrieve the situation as he can see it. But he's trying to distract people from their domestic discontents, from about 8% inflation, which is double what the Russian government's target is, from income compression. Unemployment is pretty low, though. That is one of the few bits of good news. So it's a fairly dismal story. Had a bit of a wake-up call, that shocker in Kazakhstan, his ally, when the Kazakh government shot dead 160 people or so, unarmed protesters in almost every case, and shows how quickly these situations can erupt if you treat people very, very badly. If there's no safety valve, if there's no outlet, if public opinion is hermetically sealed, if elections are completely farcical, and if people are getting poorer all the time because a tiny plutocratic elite lords over them and creams off almost all the wealth. So it's really about trying to have great power status, throwing its weight around, and not solving Russia's actual socioeconomic problems. So he'd like Ukraine to be more pro-Russian in identity, and that's not something you can do through diplomacy, really. And he's hugely alienated people who were actually quite friendly, well-disposed towards Russia, maybe even 10 years ago, despite him having attempted to murder one of their presidents, Lukashenko. Talking about a new START treaty, strategic arms limitation treaty with the United States. They might get one. There doesn't necessarily have to be a linkage to that and the Ukrainian issue. Now, so what really is aggrieving him is the idea that NATO will expand, take in more Soviet countries, and obviously the 5 NATO countries which border Russia, Norway, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland, because remember the Kaliningrad exclave, formerly Königsberg. So it's not a new thing. There are already 3 former Soviet countries which are part of NATO. What difference does one more make? It's not a new principle. You know, Norway has been on Russia's border as a NATO member for decades. Poland for quite a long time. Used to be Turkey when there was the Soviet Union. So there's no difference in principle here. But Kiev was the birthplace of Russian civilization. So he doesn't like losing the cradle of Russia and being pro-NATO, pro-EU. But he ought to ask himself, what makes NATO and the EU so attractive to former Soviet republics and the Russian model so unattractive? And just the idea is you'd be seducing and not trying to abduct countries and make himself more alluring. But no, that cognition doesn't seem to enter his cranium. So it's Ukraine is being aggressed, not Russia. Ukraine has never claimed an inch of Russian soil. They've never fired a shot at Russia. Ukraine has been invaded and legally occupied by Russia for almost 8 years. But Ukraine's not actually a NATO member. NATO doesn't owe a penny to Ukraine because they say, what has Ukraine ever done for us? All right, they sent some troops to help NATO in Afghanistan. But NATO can be quite ruthless. There's a realist school say you just cut Afghanistan loose. It was abandoned earlier this year. Quite a heartening sign for Russia. Ooh, they might do the same to Ukraine, eventually tire of it. The trouble is, it's not cost NATO a single life. It doesn't cost NATO even that much money to be propping up Ukraine. And one of the problems for NATO in funding Ukraine is corruption. There was so much speculation, money disappeared, weapons were sold off, possibly even to Russia in some cases. So he thinks that maybe the West is guilty of cowardice. They lost their courage, but if they're such yellow bellies, they will easily be scared by him into giving what he wants, but so far it hasn't worked. And if he doesn't get what he wants, he could just intensify the conflict. And no NATO country said they'll send a single soldier to help the Ukrainians, but they can make it costly for Russia. It's already cost them. You see how the ruble has fallen, the stock market's been hit by this war scare. But this idea that Western countries should cut Ukraine loose, just abandon it, we don't care, it's a faraway country which know little, well, that suggests that Putin's aims are limited. I think they're not. I think he would be emboldened by that. He would go further. Other countries like Georgia would say, well, we're going to be abandoned anyway, let's just make an accommodation with Russia. And obviously there's bad faith. The malafides on Putin's part because he's broken so many promises and he's such a pathological liar. So you couldn't trust any assurance if you tried to strike some sort of deal with him over this. Anyway, so about 30 members of NATO and only 6 of the CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization. So 72% of Ukrainians now regard Russia as a threat. It would be higher, really. Obviously, some are pro-Moscow. And they're obviously right, it is a threat. So he's really pushed them away when they were not so ill-disposed to him only a few years ago. Well, what is to be done? These negotiations being dragged out, well, in a way that's a good thing because it allows tempers to cool. He could de-escalate without losing too much face. Ukraine can build up its defenses. I don't know what they were going to have, anti-tank ditches, training more men, more weapons could be shipped to them. That's good. And by having multilateral negotiations, that's going to stall it, play for time, make it take longer. So anyway, and it's good that the severe sanctions have been threatened, and they've talked about sanctions on Putin personally, and Russia's warned them off. Well, what are you going to do? I mean, come on, you'd already be going to war against a country that's a friend of ours. So that obviously shows that would hurt him. So do it if it comes to it. Nord Stream 2 might never happen. Obviously, Russia's been trying to manipulate the oil and gas sector by reducing gas supplies to Europe during winter. But we are at least in January now, so in about 2 months it'll be spring, and somehow managed to get through winter with fairly high gas supplies, quite low supplies from Russia, making it seem we actually don't need Russia that badly. And just think, when Europe moves to hydrocarbons, away from hydrocarbons to green energy, it's not going to really need Russia at all. Who would care? There's only one manufactured item that Russia produces that people want, and that's weapons, which should be fairly low grade at the lower end of the price range. On the way that makes Russia even more perilous. It'll jeopardize us even more because that's the only thing they've got to sell is weapons. But Russia launches unprovoked attacks on other countries. That might cause Sweden to join NATO. People talk about Finland, but of course Finland signed a treaty promising not to join any alliance when it was led off the Second World War by the Soviets in 1944. But why should the Finns honor their treaties when Russia never does? So this might deter them. The idea that there'll be large weapons shipments to Russia, which would really make them suffer. So there is a chance that Russia won't escalate now. Toodaloo.